Well, what a pleasure it is to introduce Simon Schama, who is one of the most wide-ranging historians at work today. Born in London and educated at Cambridge, Simon Schama has taught at both Oxford and Cambridge. Of course, he was a professor of history at Harvard for a number of years. I was delighted when he spoke at our Houghton Library 50th Anniversary Symposium. And for many years now, he's been a university professor at Columbia, where he teaches history and art history. The books he's published are familiar, I think, to many of you, beginning with Patriots and Liberators, Revolution in the Netherlands, 1780 to 1813. He then went on to write about two Rothschilds and the land of Israel. Then a pioneering book on Dutch culture entitled The Embarrassment of Riches. He then wrote a book that he had in mind for a long time on the French Revolution called Citizens, which got an enormous amount of press and was widely reviewed. And then he wrote a small book that got a great deal of attention, especially here in Boston, Dead Certainties, Unwarranted Speculations, a wonderful, wonderful narrative about the death of General Wolfe, followed by a longer piece on the murder of George Parkman by Professor John White Webster. It was a wonderful read and irritated a lot of historians everywhere. That was followed by Landscape and Memory, which is my favorite of all of Simon's books, Rembrandt's Eyes, and recently A History of Britain, which was written in conjunction with his BBC television series. Following that, he in fact signed a contract with BBC and HarperCollins to produce 3 new books and 2 TV series. And according to Wikipedia, which is the source of all the information I have in life, it represents the biggest advance deal ever made for a TV historian. You can look it up if you wish to. Tonight, of course, he's going to be talking out of and about and signing copies of his newest book, which has been getting a great deal of attention, Rough Crossings, Britain, the Slaves, and the American Revolution. Please join me in welcoming Simon Schama to the Boston Athenaeum.
It's so nice to be back in the Athenaeum. I love it. Kind of the smell of the literary pleasure emanating from the old rugs. The fabulous drizzle, the learned drizzle, the inevitability of the Red Sox having lost the night before, actually. Well, I know, I regret it too. Well, I'm assuming, Richard, thank you so much for the incredibly generous introduction. I'm assuming in your George and Martha Washington exhibition outside, there is, of course, at least an allusion to George Washington's slave Henry Washington, who was, almost as soon as he could, decided to honor his master by escaping to the British lines as fast as he possibly could. The same is true of Ralph Henry, Patrick Henry's slave, who 1 week after hearing his master declare with kind of magnificent insouciance, "Give me liberty or give me death," said, "I think I'll have liberty," and headed for the Union Jack as quickly as he could. Both those figures, as well in keeping with a number of slaves who belonged to almost half those who'd signed the Declaration of Independence on behalf of the southern colonies shortly to become slaves. For example, no less than 30 belonging to Arthur Middleton went, again, as quickly as they could to the British. And, of course, I'll come on to the reason why they should do that. But for the moment, I just want to picture us, if you can bear it, in New York in the spring of 1783. And one particular ex-slave who had been a slave to a racehorse owner in North Carolina called Boston King subsequently became a Methodist preacher, which is how we have his memoir written when he came to England as a seminarian at a Methodist college, described exactly how it was that he and the community of nearly between 3,000 and 4,000 free blacks who'd been living in British New York during the Revolutionary War felt when the hostilities ended. About this time, Boston King writes, peace was restored between America and Great Britain, which diffused universal joy among all parties except us, who had escaped slavery and taken refuge in the English army. For a report prevailed at New York that all the slaves, in number 2,000, or in fact rather more than that, were to be delivered up to their masters, although some of them had been 3 or 4 years among the English. This dreadful rumor filled us with inexpressible anguish and terror, especially when we saw our old masters coming from Virginia, North Carolina, and other parts, and seizing upon slaves in the streets of New York, or even dragging them out of their beds. Many of the slaves had very cruel masters, so that the thought of returning home with them embittered life to us. For some days we lost our appetite for food, and sleep departed from our eyes. The English had compassion upon us in the day of our distress, and issued out a proclamation importing, quote, that all slaves should be free who had taken refuge in the British lines, and claim the sanction and privileges of the proclamations respecting the security and protection of Negroes. In consequence of this, each of us received a certificate from the commanding officer at New York, which dispelled our fears and filled us with joy and gratitude. Genuinely moving document, even if deluded, not altogether deluded about what the British were going to do, which was, in the case of New York at least, to actually honour the obligations that had been undertaken, but possibly deluded about the original motives which the British had in extending this extraordinary possibility of freedom to escaped slaves who made it to British lines. You'll know, I'm sure, that the formal beginning of that offer was made towards the end of 1775, in November 1775, by the last governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, not because he was suddenly converted to the milk of human compassion, but because he was desperately short of soldiers. He had just 300 at the time when it became a shooting war in Virginia. And as a result was prepared to contemplate anything, including the arming both of Native Americans and African and the slaves. Dunmore issues this proclamation which extends the possibility of freedom, as I say, to slaves escaping, and this is very important, from rebel plantations. If you are a slave in a loyalist plantation, tough luck. So we can see that the thing was done out of a ferocious sense of military pragmatism rather than out of a sense, as I say, of abolitionist fraternity, which is not to say, however, that even from cynical motives, inadvertent or objective good cannot be done, and was done in an extraordinary number of cases. And it is not, however, insignificant also that the immediate response to Dunmore's proclamation was absolutely electrifying. In the first few weeks, something like between 2,000 and 3,000 slaves came to the British, and enough, at any rate, for Dunmore to form the first armed free black regiment called the Ethiopian Regiment, which went to war against the Patriots with a uniform and a badge on it which said "Liberty to Slaves," no insignificant moment in the annals of African American history. 2 actions were fought. One was successful. One was a small victory. The other was a big defeat, described in my book and in most military histories. But what was extraordinary was that even after these defeats, actually, even after the British retreated in ignominious chaos to the ships waiting off Norfolk Harbour, African Americans continued to flock to Dunmore's ships, and indeed to the improvised fort just in front of Norfolk, in such numbers that the British officers really didn't know actually how they would cope. They ran out of uniforms, they ran out of food. As usual, they behaved with unconscionable brutality very often, occasionally diluted with genuine magnanimousness. Some, if you were unlucky enough to catch smallpox, which any of you who've read Elizabeth Venn's really wonderful book will know, ran like a kind of scourge, particularly through the African population. Both the Americans and the British were pretty quick to ditch those who might be infect regular soldiers. Nonetheless, the most extraordinary exodus takes place. From the beginning to the end of the war, conservatively, historians think between 80 and 100,000 African Americans escape from rebel plantations in an attempt to reach British lines under the protection of the Dunmore Proclamation, which was reissued both by General Howe and by Sir Henry Clinton, who one can say was the one commander-in-chief up until the very end of the war who really meant it, I think, from the bottom of his heart, and who took measures to take care of those who served, particularly in regiments of sappers like the Black Pioneers. This is an extraordinary figure. It represents 20% of all the slave population at the time, and the African-American population, as I'm sure you know, represents what Gary Nash calls the lost fifth, 1/5 of the entire population of colonial America. So we have a really astonishing phenomenon taking place. Now, were all those who were determined to try and reach British lines coming in answer to some sense that British justice and Old English freedom was actually going to extend its benevolent protection over them? Probably not. But it was more than simply the British being their enemy's enemy. There was the sense, of course, that if you were going to take advantage of this situation, you couldn't just disappear into the creeks of the Chesapeake or into the hills of Virginia and Piedmont. You needed protection. So partly out of, I think, a genuine optimism about what British intentions were, and partly out of sheer necessity on their part, this extraordinary exodus takes place. Boats are stolen. You have to imagine tens of thousands of people walking by night, some of them swimming, some of them taking small boats, the equivalent of dinghies, some even swimming out to the British ships. We have letter after letter after letter from beleaguered British naval officers saying picked up yet another 20 in a small cutter. And terribly interestingly, those American historians much more authoritative than I about this tell me that, well, we know really that in most cases of runaways before the Revolutionary War, as you'd expect, most of those leading escapes, or indeed making escapes, were young adult males. But we know from a document called the Book of Negroes that's compiled in New York in 1783, it was a mixed Anglo-American commission of officers at the dock who were examining the life history, the stories of all those escaped slaves who'd ended up in New York to determine whether or not they qualified for the entitlement to go free with the white loyalists and the British troops. So we have tiny potted biographies. Those of you interested can find the Book of Negroes published, an excellent edition by the historian Graham Russell Hodges. So we know, for example, apologies for the digression, so uncharacteristic of Simon Schama to digress. This is not so much a lecture as a kind of Joycean ejaculation, but hey, what's wrong with that? We know from that actually a striking number of groups actually are women, and women with small children, women who then subsequently meet men, they subsequently become pregnant. Traveling in family groups is a very moving and very striking characteristic of this phenomenon. So we have this astonishing moment, really, in which a huge proportion of the slave population are in incredible peril to their end. If they were caught, they'd be hanged, they might be sent to the saltpeter mines, they might be sent back to the plantations where pitiless punishments were visited on them in the cases that we know. So you were taking just the most enormous risk in undertaking this. And nonetheless, as I say, from the beginning to the end of the war, from the beginning of the Lord Dunmore's proclamation, in fact, even before that, to the final hideous fiasco at Yorktown, this phenomenon continued to be true. In fact, actually, not to preempt the story, what is truly extraordinary about how the legend, you might say, of British freedom and justice was implanted inside the black community, it happens all over again in 1812. When the British get anywhere near Washington, for example, there's a sudden, immense upheaval, immense sort of spike in runaways to the British population. And again in the War of 1812, many of them depart with the British, in this case back to Canada. There are whole townships in Canada, Preston, Nova Scotia, near Halifax, whose population descends directly from that second wave of escaped slave emigrants in the year of 1812. Now, really, where did this come from? Where did this belief come from, other than simply crediting this proclamation, which the British took care would be distributed in numbers, but we're talking about hundreds of broadsides, which then would be read by thousands of people. It is true, as John Adams noted in South Carolina in 1784, is that the Negroes have a wonderful art of spreading intelligence among them, meaning, intelligence as in information, the kind of intelligence we wish the CIA, for example, might occasionally cultivate. The gathering of reliable information. So we know there was a kind of network of news and information that went round. In fact, it's not surprising because, of course, not all slaves were field hands. So many were mobile, were carters and drovers and pilots. And in fact, the British Army used the intimate knowledge that the black population had of the tidal waters of the Chesapeake Estuary, particularly, or the down waters of the Rice Low Country in South Carolina, for their own good, to actually raid areas that were held by the Patriots. But it goes, there is something even more extraordinary than that, which accounts for the first part of my book, which is not set in America but in London. And that is that in Virginia in 1773 and 1774, an astonishing series of, not many of them, but enough for us to raise our eyebrows, a very surprising set of advertisements for the recapture of runaway slaves appear in the Virginia Gazette. And what they say, in effect, is that so-and-so, Cato or Pompey or Scipio or Lucy or Betsy, has run away in the deluded belief, run away to British ships in the hope of taking ship, in the deluded belief, owing to the late Somerset case, about which in a minute, owing to the late Somerset case, that there can be no slavery in Old England. And the first part of my book is actually about a series of cases fought by the indomitable and redoubtable Granville Sharp. One of these, I'm very fond of heroes who back into the historical limelight rather than, like General Washington out there seem to have, destiny coming out of their nostrils, like heroic bogies, sort of from the very beginning. My heroes, I think I enjoy writing about them, are people who don't expect to be important in any way at all. And certainly Granville Sharp didn't. He's the son of an archdeacon of Northumberland, and he gets a menial job in this family of brothers in the Ordnance Office, ordering up, incredibly boringly in the Tower, wig powder and boot blacking and stuff like that. And he does it. What really excites him is a sort of fierce debate with abstruse theologians of the Old Testament as to what exactly it was in the treasures of the temple that were carried off by King Cyrus in the reign of Nehemiah, in the reign at the time of the prophet Nehemiah. And so he's destined to be a sort of an endearing, obscure eccentric. But something happens one day. The Sharp brothers, you may know, very Athenaeum kind of thing, were family performers. They were a family chamber concert group. There was an ironmonger called James who played the serpent and large brass instruments as well. Granville himself played the double flute, rather extraordinarily. One of the sisters played the harpsichord. I can't remember what the brother, William, who was the surgeon, played, but it's in a beautiful painting by Zoffany. Richard will undoubtedly remember. The crucial figure here in the family group, and they played also very famously on the river. They did waterborne concerts of Handel. That was their thing. Became rather famous for it. But before they'd taken to their boat, called the Apollo, they met in Mincing Lane in this street quite near the Tower of London. So Granville Sharp could kind of walk across every day to the Sharps for rehearsals. And one day he's coming to his brother's surgery. His brother is a surgeon to the king, which is less grand than it sounds. There were lots of surgeons to the king. There are an awful lot of medical conditions to deal with. But William Sharp also did something remarkable. He actually opened his surgery gratis to the poor of the city in the East End, Gesundheit, once a week. And it was on one of those occasions that Granville Sharp was coming to see him, and this long line of extremely poor, suffering victims stretched down this street called Mincing Lane. And Granville actually had been inside the house. He'd been rehearsing, and he came out. And up in the line was this Negro called Jonathan Strong, who'd been so badly pistol-whipped. We know from Granville Sharp's own notes when he talked to poor Jonathan Strong, there was very little left of his face. The pistol had actually separated, and he'd been viciously abused by his master, who was a lawyer, who'd lived in the West Indies, had Jonathan Strong as a house servant and then just treated him like trash and then threw him away when he thought he was going to die. The brothers take Jonathan Strong into the house. They bind up his wounds. In fact, there was a fantastically moving, which is included in Granville Sharp's papers in the New York Historical Society. And yes, here it is. It's very. This is written by Strong himself a little later on. I could hardly walk or see my way where I was going. When I came to him, William Sharp, he saw me in that condition. The gentleman take charity of me and gave me some stuff to wash my eyes with and some money to get myself a little necessaries till next day. The day after, I come to the gentleman, and he sent me to the hospital, and it was parts and parts. And I was in there 4 months and a half. All the while I was in the hospital, or the gentleman, the two Sharps, find me clothes and shoes and stockings. And when I come out, they paid for my lodging and money to find myself necessaries till they get me into a place. The job was a job with an apothecary who delivered medical supplies and drugs and lints and splints and so on. And so Jonathan Strong gets better, and then he makes the mistake of getting so much better, he rides postilion for the apothecary's wife, Mrs. Brown, where he's seen by his old master one day, about 2 or 3 years later. And the master thinks, I thought he was dead, but goodness, I've let an investment get away. London was full of slave catchers whose job it was to actually take back escaped enslaved body servants. So the ex-owner hires one of these, they kidnap Jonathan Strong. He's taken as and the idea was to sort of clap them aboard and send them to the West Indies for a sale. You made a kind of an advance sale with the captain who's going to sell his goods to slave auctions in the West Indies. This is what happened even before they'd laid hands on Jonathan Strong. Jonathan Strong has that treatment meted out to him. He's taken to Poultry Counter, but one, as I say in the book, the fate of blacks in London and Britain, and by extrapolation, all the way across the Atlantic, rested on one extraordinary, simple thing, that while he'd been employed with Brown the apothecary, Jonathan Strong had learned to read or write. He'd become literate. And he sends a note to Granville Sharp. Granville Sharp, for the moment, still worrying about the treasures and Nehemiah and King Cyrus, can't remember the case. And then another note gets sent, and then he does remember, and Sharp goes to Poultry Counter, arranges through habeas corpus for a hearing to be held in front of the Lord Mayor of London, Sir Robert Kite, and actually liberates Jonathan Strong. This is the moment which is a kind of Pauline moment, Damascene moment for Granville Sharp himself. He carries on doing his bootblacking ordering, but he trains himself in the history of the common law, and in particular in the history of unfree persons in England. He discovers the exciting phrase, rather quaint phrase, which becomes profoundly important to him, which says the air of England is too pure for slaves to breathe. It had been first invoked in the case of a Russian serf who claimed protection of the English common law during the reign of Elizabeth I. And then there had been a battle about whether or not, when a slave owner from the West Indies came to Britain with a slave as a personal servant, that slave had the right, should he choose, to liberate himself from bondage or not. And various justices at various times have given different opinions. Sharp is an idealist, not to say utopian, about English freedom and the English common law generally, and utterly believes in the incompatibility of slavery with the tradition of the English common law. In fact, there is this fantastically fabulous strain, of course, in 18th century discourse of neo-medievalism, dreams dreamed about the miraculous primitive freedom bestowed on England by the likes of King Alfred the Great, of which, with his natural antiquarian fever, Granville Sharp is the supreme exponent. He indeed believes that the most perfect form of government yet ever invented by the wit of man is something called frank pledge, which he thinks the medieval Saxons had in common with the children of Israel, which is sort of the sort of politically ideological form of mixed marriage, which goes beyond the fantastic. And frank pledge was a kind of neighborhood government. Every 10 households elect one tithing man. Tithing men together in a group of 10 elect 100 or and so on. And Sharp takes this. This is very important for Sharp. Anyway, the point being that Sharp then fights a series of famous legal battles, all of which concern escaped slaves who've been abducted and kidnapped, and with the attempt to send them to the West Indies. And the most famous of all is in 1772, concerning the fate of one James Somerset. It goes all the way up to the King's Bench and the Lord Chief Justice, Lord Mansfield, who originally regards Granville Sharp as an irritating little gadfly, and then comes to promotes Granville Sharp to the status of extreme annoyance, actually. Sometimes Sharp is in court. When he's not, he is brilliant at briefing a team of lawyers who often take the case on for free. And it goes all the way to Somerset, and Mansfield is absolutely desperate to try and treat the case of Somerset, not to make a general ruling about the status of slaves, because he was socially deeply conservative, even though he's been responsible for raising, rather remarkably, a young black girl in his house, who is the offspring of his nephew's, who's the illegitimate offspring of his nephew's common law marriage, basically. Anyway, it's another beautiful painting of the two girls, one blonde, one black, actually still exists in Kenwood now. So there's a great showdown moment in the summer of 1772, and this is what happens. I just want to read you now, without doing this incredibly. Here we are. Yes. Okay. What happens on the 22nd of June in Westminster Hall, because it becomes a great cause célèbre. Even though Mansfield is desperate not to make a general ruling, it's widely reported in the press. Everybody kind of senses some extraordinary showdown in which the fate not just of London blacks, who are very poor but becoming quite articulate, but also in some sense the fate of the dignity of the common law is essentially invested in this moment. On Monday, the 22nd of June, 1772, at 11 o'clock in the morning, all of London and beyond seem to have come to Westminster Hall, spilling from the coffee houses and taverns, law courts and mercantile establishments, the shops and exhibition rooms, coming by carriage and sedan chair, horse and foot, from the trim new squares to the west and the clattering city streets to the east. Since 1740, the interior of the ancient Gothic chamber had been divided by an elaborate wooden screen. On one side were the two courtrooms of the King's Bench and Chancery. On the other, a vast public space, a field of stone, where people stood, sat, perused the shops at the walls, and when a judgment was to be given, halted and listened. Among that crowd this day were black faces who greeted Mansfield and Justices Ashton, Wills, and Ashurst as the four long wigs passed through the screen and into King's Bench, carefully ascending the low steps where once the judges of Charles I had hectored the deposed king. Silvertongue, that was Mansfield's name, he was all kind of witty bonhomie. Silvertongue appeared for the moment tongue-tied, uncharacteristically leaden. We know all this, by the way, from Sharp's wonderful case notes, actually preserved in his commonplace book. Uncharacteristically leaden, his habitual affability oppressed by the burdensome expectations of history. More than ever, the hall seemed not merely a court of law, his court of law, but as it had been centuries before, the true Curia Regis, the court of the king and the kingdom. England glowered in a summer chill, and for once the Lord Chief Justice wore his famous learning moodily. But in the dim and stony silence he proceeded, his Perthshire lilt, which I will not attempt, lost to many as it floated through the wooden screen and out into the dusty vastness, where first it competed with a hubbub of people browsing the wig and pen stalls that lined the perimeter. But then it became understood that judgment was to be given, and there was a hush. Mansfield resumed. It was not, he said, as some, indeed many, might suppose, some great and general issue that was to be judged, but merely whether or not there was sufficient cause for the return. The return, of course, you could do, those of you, many of you, I'm sure, in the law will know about returns of writ. In other words, Captain Knowles's reply to the writ of habeas corpus an opportunity to make a return to the writ. In other words, habeas corpus, release the Negro, return, you've stolen my property. Charging he and Mr. Stewart, not the Negro, have been the victims of an unlawful act. Those who were about to sell had been essentially the victims of a felony. So Mansfield goes on, if there were cause for the return to the writ, the Negro must be detained. If not. It was as plain as that. Unease rippled through the hall. For some time, the Lord Chief Justice made his way through not just this case, but others concerning similar escapes and detentions, and became warm when affirming, somewhat improbably, that all had been said against it, that York and Talbot, that was the opinion which said, in fact, there was nothing inconsistent with the common law of having slaves in England, that York and Talbot had stated that neither the fact of a slave coming into England, much less his or her baptism, could be held to set the rights of masters at naught, and yet the public heard this shift. While slavery had been and was many things, quote, in different ages and states, the exercise of the power of a master over his slave must be supported by the laws of particular countries. But no foreigner can, in England, claim such a right over a man. Such a claim is not known to the laws of England. The power claimed never was in use here or acknowledged by the law. No master ever was allowed here to take a slave by force to be sold abroad because he had deserted from his service or for any other reason whatever. We cannot say the cause set forth by this return to the writ is allowed or approved of by the laws of this kingdom. Therefore, the Lord Chief Justice made sure not to pause, therefore the man must be discharged. He rose, and so did Justices Ashton, Wills, and Ashurst, but before they disappeared through the low door at the side of the hall opening to the robing room, something happened that stirred even the jaded sentiments of the port and pipe hacks, there in force from the Gazettes, Chronicles, and Posts, morning and evening, and the Daily Advertiser. As Mansfield and his colleagues emerged through the screen, the group of blacks in the public space, quote, this is from the Daily Advertiser, bowed with profound respect to the judges. Then they shook hands vigorously with each other, congratulating themselves, quote, upon their recovery of the rights of human nature and their happy lot that permitted them to breathe the free air of England. No sight upon earth, wrote another reporter for the Morning Chronicle, could be more pleasingly affecting to the feeling mind than the joy which shone at that instant in these poor men's countenances. Now, it's a sort of almost absurdly sentimental moment, but an important and powerful historical one. And what is extraordinary, of course, is that the news, while Mansfield is determined to say what's at issue is not can slavery be legal in Britain, but can it be possible for an erstwhile slave master to actually abduct his former property and remove him somewhere where he would not have the protection of the English common law. That's what Mansfield wanted to do, and that's in fact what he did do. But, of course, sometimes misreadings and misinterpretations have an explosive force beyond the letter of the law, and that's precisely what happened. Slave owners in England and the Caribbean and America were aghast by what they thought the Lord Chief Justice had done. Blacks in England, and now we know in Virginia and the American plantations too, were exhilarated by the possibility it seemed to represent. So there then unfolds this extraordinary moment of the exodus of the 100,000 over many years. Some of them actually do bear arms, contrary to an assertion made over and over again that the British were never prepared to deliver arms in the hands of the freed blacks. This is not true. We know from records in the Public Record Office, for example, that General Prevost, during the siege, reporting on the siege of Savannah, describes particularly that he says the blacks in fighting showed no poor countenance. It's quite clear that they certainly wounded. They're right in the thick of combat. Many more of them are given the most menial work to do. That is undoubtedly true as well. They are laundresses and cooks and latrine emptiers, but a large number of them are also sappers. What is quite clear is that when they're with the British, and there are, of course, their counterparts in the Continental Army, one must never forget, though not many, and I'm very happy to answer questions about what was happening on the American side. We should, by the way, yet another digression, can you stand one? Since we've got, Crispus Attucks land out there, we should, is there a memorial to Crispus Attucks? There's got to be lots, right? Yes. Okay, do we have a memorial to Newton Prince? Newton who, you all say? Who he? Well, I'll tell you who he. Newton Prince was a barber who was called by John Adams, remember him? Your second president, and to stand as witness in the case of the Boston Massacre, to sort of substantiate John Adams. You remember John Adams was defending the British troops, actually, on account that they'd been provoked, and it was, while it was all regrettable, it was essentially a response to a panic, which is more or less the case. It doesn't actually exonerate the British for what actually happened at the Boston Massacre, but that is more or less what happened. So Newton Prince simply says what he sees, among which he's seen Crispus Attucks fall. Well, how many days went past, you suppose, before he's tarred and feathered and almost actually killed while this happens? So when General Howe's army invests Boston, he's one of the first to actually say, patriots don't think so, actually, and sort of leaves, in fact, is evacuated to Nova Scotia with Howe's army at the time the British leave. So it's a complicated story. There are families, actually, which are divided inside themselves. Yeah, and some of them actually don't make the same decision even within the same family. Let me tell you, do I have time, Richard? A bit more time? Okay, let me tell you about the white cuffs. Half-hanged white cuff. Who's a good example of somebody making a difficult decision. Getting himself hanged was just the start of Benjamin Whitecuff's problems. Once he'd had serious prospects. His father, a free-born mulatto, like many blacks around New York, had made a living from coastal trading around the Sound. A good living, too, since he owned a sloop. But the Jeffersonian dream visited Pa Whitecuff. This is how Benjamin, his son, describes him, not me. And he had traded the boat for a farm at Hempstead, Kings County on Long Island, and not a mere scrap of waste either, but over 60 acres of prime pasture, a 2-acre orchard, and land in the village. And it was a good team of plough oxen to work it, so he'd evidently been his own man, the model of a sturdy, independent smallholder on which the new republic was supposed to be based. His son Benjamin learned the trade of a saddler, handy enough occupation in the Whitecuff's rural world. Come the Revolution, this little felicity disappeared. Whitecuff Sr. had heeded the patriotic call, joined the Continental Army, and risen to the rank of sergeant. He'd also taken Benjamin's brother along with him in the American cause. But Benjamin himself was stubborn and taken the opposite view, thinking to do better by the king than by the revolution. The divided family, no doubt with a heavy heart, but also perhaps with a prudent eye to the future, decided that should the British come to Hempstead, Benjamin should claim the farm as his own, therefore not get it confiscated, obviously. Whether Benjamin's allegiance was determined by principle or opportunism is impossible to gauge, but his loyalism went well beyond prudent self-interest. He didn't actually need to volunteer for the British. Remember, he's free. He's not going to get his freedom, but he decides he's going to do this anyway. As a free black, he had no need of Sir Henry Clinton's incentive, but he did so. And what was more, in the supremely dangerous office of spy, there are a lot of black spies, the British, a lot of black Major Andres. During the erratic pursuit of Washington's army across New Jersey, he delivered intelligence to Sir William Ayscough about American troop movements and was credited with saving a force of 2,000 from marching into an engagement against superior odds. But during his 2 years spying, Benjamin took one chance too many and was captured by the Americans near their lines. Only one fate was deemed proper for a spy, and Benjamin was duly strung up near Cranberry, New Jersey. There he swung for 3 minutes while the noose failed, as they sometimes did, to break his neck. He was still hanging and still alive, though barely, when a troop of the 5th Light Horse arrived and cut him down from the gibbet. His father and brother had not been so fortunate. The one was killed during the skirmish at Chestnut Hill, the other done for at the Battle of Germantown. So, in fact, actually, Benjamin, he actually goes back to the farm. Then he re-enlists as a spy. He's captured again. He's incredibly badly treated. And come the end of the war, and I did want to say that there are extraordinary moments of military engagement. There's a band of black guerrillas called the Black Brigade operating on the Hudson River under one called Colonel Ty, a a former slave in Monmouth County who makes a speciality of hits on patriot militia, little miniature forts and homesteads up and down the New Jersey side of the shore and sometimes the Westchester side as well. There's a black boat battalion that almost refuses to stop fighting even when the peace is finally concluded. But what happens actually, these are the sort of people familiar to Boston King who had the greatest trepidations about what fate held in store come the end of the war. At which point, something actually happens that is a moment of genuine, authentic decency, I believe, and worth, again, finding its way somehow into the social studies curriculum textbooks. The last commander-in-chief of the British Army is a man called Sir Guy Carleton. He is your standard Anglo-Irish, second-rate dunderhead, basically. But he's a genuinely good egg, as dunderheads go. He's horrified, and he's faced, of course, with this mass of fury that were the white loyalists. I mean, really what we had in the American Revolution, I'm speaking as someone not only who lived in and loves Boston, was here for 13 years, but also someone who spent almost exactly half my life on both sides of the Atlantic, So my passions are absolutely equally, and my irritations exactly equally distributed. But what we had in the American Revolution was the first really imperial civil war. Important. So that, many good books have been written about loyalism and the Tories, but not enough. I mean, it's extraordinary, you remember, again, this is a little, you remember, any of you see this truly woeful picture called Patriot, made by Professor Mel Gibson, who never set foot in Houghton Library, did he, Richard, when he's seen it? And, there's that, why do I hate that movie so much? Well, let me count the ways. Partly because, actually, it represents Francis Marion, who was a genuinely interesting partisan South Carolina and so-called swamp fox, actually, freeing his slaves. Nothing could be further from the truth. And then the slaves all say, we fight for freedom, will you, massa, And in fact, not only did they not fight for freedom, actually, Francis Marion fought an action against a company of mounted black British dragoons at a place called Wadboo Plantation. A tiny action, but really quite important. So my point is, we'll know that really the historiography has been properly revised when Mel Gibson finally makes a movie called Tory! It's not going to happen, is it, somehow, Australian, don't think so. So this is a kind of huge moment of uproar, really. And of course the Tories are not just all these kind of fat old right-wing merchants living on Brattle Street, some of them are, but they're kind of tiny smallholders and farmers and dry goods merchants and minor magistrates and, just like their counterparts on the other side. So Guy Carleton walks into this massive sea. They feel, of course, they've been sold out utterly by the Shelburne government. There is still a hugely determined, not necessarily determined, but there is a large British force still on Long Island and Staten Island and heavily invested, and it's the end of the war, and there are some cards to play. When they finally reconcile themselves that, they were going to have to decide to live in free America, what they wanted was that their property should not go forfeit, really, because the Crown had stupidly made the promise that it wouldn't. There'd be a proper negotiation about it. And it was all basically 5 to 12 on the roof of the hotel in Saigon as far as the Shelburne government was concerned. So here comes Guy Carleton. There's a meeting demanded by George Washington, with whom they had slightly frosty relations. Very weirdly, everybody commented how much they looked like each other, which annoyed the hell out of Washington, actually. How stoical, how calm, how genteel. Washington hated that. And also, he kept on getting these letters from Guy Carleton, which began, "My dear General," which also got up his nose no end. So there's a conference arranged to discuss simply the evacuation of British troops at Japan on the Hudson River in May 1783. And Guy Carleton goes, and Washington at that moment, it's very important to know, is being hounded by his fellow slaveholders. And he, of course, having famously conflicted feelings, will free his slaves. But all of his constituency, as it were, not just in Virginia, but in all of the South, all of the slave-owning part of America, is saying, we now want our Negroes back, thank you. And as Boston King said, the streets of New York were full of slave catchers. Furthermore, Article 7 of the Provisional Treaty of Paris, signed by Franklin J. and Richard Oswald and go on, had suddenly, at the very, very last minute, for reasons that are too complicated to go into, had suddenly said there shall be no carrying off, quote, of property and Negroes. So the first item on the agenda at this meeting was going to be the return of the former property that were former slaves. So they sit down together in this room, which still exists in the Amos de Wint House in Japan. And Washington goes straight to the point. And what Guy Carleton basically says, he steps up to the plate. The dunderhead makes good. He steps up to the plate utterly. And he says, well, I wish I could oblige you, my dear General, but you have to understand they're all free and they're coming with us. What he says is even more annoying. He says, I'm sure, General Washington, you would not wish an obligation entered into in solemn good faith by His Majesty's government, and those commanders representing them would wish to be so freely violated as you seem to suggest it may be. And then he says they are already embarked. And Washington then, a wonderful description by William Smith, the Loyalist former Attorney General, describes Washington reddening and for once losing his control, his voice rising and saying, already embarked. He actually bizarrely hadn't known that the previous month, April, had seen a huge sailing which included white and free black loyalists as well. What was Washington to do? He could restart the war if he wanted to. He held off any final exchange of prisoners, but he wasn't going to do that. So he has to accept as a fait accompli 12,000 black loyalists that had already departed from Charleston and Savannah. This final group, between 3,000 and 5,000, were going to go with the British, and go they did. And here's the scene down at the dock as a result in 1783. How much longer do I have, Richard? Tell me, and then I can trim my 10 minutes. Good. All right. On the waterfront, in the rank, grimy sweat of high summer, on the days before embarkation, a passerby would have observed a heaped mass of rope and canvas, a logjam of wagons and horses, the creak of masts, the crack of whips, cursing drivers, opportunist gulls, hogs and dogs, ship's cows lowing as they were herded on board, skinny ship's cats already prowling the decks, barrels and tons of salt tack and biscuit, tar and rum blocking the wharf, drunks from the grog shop lurching between them, chests piled high as a house on the decks before being lowered into the hold, the usual swarm of sailors and stevedores and buyers and vendors and thieves and whores, much pissing and kissing, a capering fiddler, a thunderer handing out tracts to save souls lest the deep take them. But also amidst the melee, an observer would have seen the passengers, men with their hats on and their coats off, bonneted women, scatters of children, some dozing, some scampering, some slouching towards their frightening future. Hundreds, on some days thousands of them, many of whom had seen better days, and some of whom had seen much, much worse. Two different worlds were going with the ladies' adventure, the Grand Duchess of Russia, the Peggy, the Mars, the Hesperus, the Fishburne, the Kingston, the Stafford, the Clinton, the Abondance. Between April and November 1783, 27,000 loyalists embarked, uprooted, disconsolate, demoralized, stripped of power, wealth, and property, or even simple farms and cottages. Many of them roiling with bitterness at their betrayers in London, the fat politicians counting their gold from East India opium, salt and tea, yes, that tea, and the generals who got to retire to a country estate in the Shires while decent loyalists had to make shift hundreds of miles to the north, beginning again in the piney desert amidst ravening beasts, bears and wolves, or on the cobbled byways of an alien town. And these dispossessed loyalists were less than delighted to be cheek by jowl with that other class of people, dressed who knows how, scarcely more than beggars or low tavern musicians, babies sucking at the tit, a class of people who might teach their own slaves insolent manners. Worse, the blacks had the gall to sing while they were lost in sorrow. Sing. What was there to sing about? Everything. Rebirth, British freedom, God's loving kindness, his all-encompassing mercy, the honest goodness of the king, the word of Sir Guy Carleton, the promises of food for a year, a piece of land for the rest of their lives, born again, born again. The wide sea water lay before them out beyond the harbour. There had been so many boats, so many passages in the night, so many experiences on the water over which they were about to be conveyed to a new life. There were the petty augers, the little flat-bottom boats they had taken while they lay low in the reeds of Carolina, the tenders that had taken them out to the big ships, the ins and outs of the islands and marshes of the Chesapeake, their folk dying on the sands from fever, the whaleboats that had hunted them, and the whaleboats in which they themselves had hunted. The mud they had walked, hard or enveloping, the rivers they'd swum across, and wherever they found themselves, they'd been looking always for Jordan. That is reconstructed from the other beautiful memoir written by the Baptist David George, who's one of these people and who becomes a very important figure in the settlement in Nova Scotia and subsequently in Sierra Leone, about which I don't really have time to say very much, but I'd be very happy to answer questions. I want to do just one more tiny reading and then finish. Heartache lies ahead in Nova Scotia. These people are going clutching General Birch certificates. The first passport that the slave population had, ex-slave, now free population. Children who were born in British New York during the Revolution have a little document that says "born free" behind British lines, and the BBF is inscribed in the Book of Negroes when they get on board. But of course, actually, the fury that the white loyalists felt then becomes a serious obstacle, a serious obstruction to them getting their allotment of acres when they're in Nova Scotia. One of them, who I think of and have described as the first identifiable African-American politician, a sergeant in the British Army called Thomas Peters, becomes a kind of spokesman for the grievances that he sees inflicted on this population in Nova Scotia, makes it all the way back to London, astonishingly, extraordinary story, finds the ear of the black community, then through them the abolitionist community, and through them the government, rather amazingly. And the government decided to send somebody to Nova Scotia to see if in fact it was the case that the king's and the government's promises in respect of freedom, but particularly in respect of land, had not been carried out. And for those who did not want to stay in Nova Scotia after many years of desperate poverty and almost destitution, almost kind of non-titular slavery through indentured service, they decided to make the offer of settlement in Sierra Leone, which has already had an earlier doomed settlement before. And they send this extraordinary figure called John Clarkson, who's the younger brother of a much more famous abolitionist, Thomas Clarkson, 27-year-old naval lieutenant, who'd served in the Caribbean without the slightest sign of really fretfulness about the iniquity of the slave trade, but then becomes amanuensis to his brother, and he too has a kind of Pauline conversion moment. Clarkson leaves us an 800-page journal of what happens when he goes to Nova Scotia, how he assembles this extraordinary Exodus fleet of 15 ships, taking 1,300 African Americans back to Africa, many of whom, of course, had last experienced the Atlantic Ocean in chains. So Clarkson travels in a hospital ship. He lays down very strict rules about diet, about ventilation, about sanitation, about the distance between decks. He becomes, in the words of David George, who becomes a friend of his, their Moses. And I want to finish with one moment, one incredibly telling moment. He travels out in Nova Scotia. He finds another person who backs into history. He finds his historical presence. He is a sort of weird combo of kind of Russell Crowe and Master and Commander and Woody Allen. He's sort of simultaneously fabulously brave and stoical and stupendously neurotic in the kind of romantic evangelical way. So he writes everything down. On Tuesday, he's totally unworthy for the task. On Wednesday, he can't think of anything better to do, and so on. So you have absolutely everything out there on the page, on this extraordinary, amazing document, one of the great, I think, pieces of writing, actually, of late 18th century literature. Anyway, on October the 26th, 1791, he goes out to the free black township of Birchtown, just outside Shelburne, a place of great kind of heroic endurance, but again, desperate poverty. And he makes this kind of formal offer which he's very concerned should not be overread. He's worried that as horrible as conditions were in Nova Scotia, they might possibly be even worse in Sierra Leone, and that he shouldn't oversell the expedition, that he shouldn't actually, people should not sell their little 40 acres in Nova Scotia unless they were utterly, utterly committed to doing it. So he reads the offer of the government and the Sierra Leone company in very dry terms. And it's a wonderful scene. We know all about it from Clarkson's diary. It was going to be a great open-air meeting, like a prayer meeting. There were these many churches, of course, in... one of the great moving things about this whole story of this black diaspora, loyalist diaspora, is that there are so many firsts. The first free black churches, the first free black schools, the first black genuine awareness of what their political rights may be. And the churches are exceptionally important at this moment. So, but it's pouring with rain. So they all gather inside the biggest of the church, which is Moses Wilkinson, who's a blind, lame, charismatic Methodist preacher. And crowds, they're so dense, so the entire village has come out. And there's a little pulpit, and this young man, really, at that moment just flooded with a sense of his, and burdened by his responsibility, goes up into the pulpit. Clarkson, standing in Moses Wilkinson's pulpit, had done his duty. He'd been as stern and cautious as he promised himself he should. Yet every so often as he said something about their land or about Africa, cries and shouts of joy went up as if he were a prophet. And in the end, he could not help himself. He had to offer himself indeed as their father patriarch, their white Moses. As soon as they got themselves to Halifax, the assembly point to go on to Africa, he said, and here's his diary, they must look up to me as their friend and protector, that I should at all times be happy to redress their grievances and ready to defend them with my life, in return for which I expected their good behavior during the passage, that they would give me as little trouble as possible and lend a willing hand whenever their assistance might be required, giving them, however, to understand that this last request would be entirely voluntary on their part, for they must consider themselves in every respect as passengers, not as slaves. No compulsive methods would be adopted towards them, nor would a white sailor be suffered on any account with impunity to lift up his hand against them. When they got to Africa, Clarkson solemnly promised he would personally see they each got their allotted land, and declared, quote, I would never leave them till each individual assured me he was perfectly satisfied. No white man had ever spoken to them like this. They had endured captivity, then degradation. They'd been sold, flogged, made to labor like beasts. Then they'd endured the terrors of flight, had seen smallpox-wasted bodies lying untended and unburied on the shore. Their soldiers, pioneers, shot about. They had frozen in the wastes of Nova Scotian winter and had their entitlements stolen from them. And somehow, through their ministers and men of God, they had still not entirely abandoned hope. And here was this pale young officer in his blue coat, thin as a swaying birch, saying these things that opened their ears, their eyes, and their hearts. Clarkson was done now, and again there was a burst of exultation, with shouts of praise and affirmation. Coming down from the pulpit, he was swamped by effusive, rowdy joy. Thanks very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I say with the trepidation of anyone saying this ever in the Athens of America, I'm happy to answer questions. What a lie that is. Now, of course I am, but again, I'm nervous about the assembled cleverness. So if you'd rather all go and have a drink and some cheese, that's fine too. But no, I'm very happy to answer questions, of course, take some questions. Yes, gentleman here. Oh God, not many. I think actually about... There is a very interesting minor character called Stephen Bluke, who's a schoolmaster, and who was sort of jeered at by both blacks and whites because he was a bit of a dresser. And he's really a kind of almost chief magistrate at Birchtown, and he is against the Sierra Leone exercise. He thinks actually it's a kind of betrayal of the Nova Scotian promises. And he persuades the Nova Scotian authorities to kind of bribe blacks. I should say the white loyalists had a ferocious interest in the blacks not going because they were a cheap source of labor. They weren't slaves, but they were they were the gardeners and the cooks and the cleaners and the janitors. Gee, how life has changed. And so they didn't really want them to go. So Bluch, in fact, I mean, the short answer to your question is something like 1,000 out of, so something like between 10 and 15% stay. And there are very few descendants still left. There was a distinctive community at Preston. I have to tell you this awful story, because when I went out to Preston, and there was actually, any of you want to check this out on the wonders of the internet, there was a very good black loyalist heritage website run from Nova Scotia. And there's a tiny museum, very, very moving little museum, both at Halifax, just outside Halifax, and then in Birchtown itself. There's an archaeological dig going on, which is extraordinary, around the black town of Birchtown. The Shelburne Historical Society, run by wonderful old ladies with fierce Canadian-British tea, has marvelous documentation. But actually, when I went to rent a car in Halifax and said I wanted to go to Preston, they looked at me as though, and it said Preston. So, well, the last guy I went to Preston, there was an iron bar around his neck. Heard the same miserably depressing cliches. And then I said, well, guess what, I'm going. I guess I'll take my chances. And he said, and I couldn't believe, actually, that I guess, Canada catches up, finally, with the United States, even in its kind of hideous racial stereotypes. He said, yes, very good boxers, Preston. I thought. Anyway, it's a wonderful combination. It's still a village. There are churches, there are schools, and there are people fishing, but there are also kids in hoodies doing hip-hop, so, which I think the black preachers would have liked, actually. Yes, Jen? Oh, wow, that is such a long story. They have a very difficult time of it, because actually, for various reasons, this 15-fleet ship is late leaving, and they arrive right in the rainy season. There is no immunity to African diseases. They'd lost it all in America and Nova Scotia, and this is often the second generation. So it's terrible mortality, but they do hang on. They create, look, the first women in the history of the world to vote for anything at all are the free black women householders of Sierra Leone in the 1790s who vote for local government officers. Do we find that even in history textbooks? Even in History of Women? I don't think so. So it's a remarkable 10-year experiment. After a while, there's a ferocious French raid. The French come, of course, as liberators, offering universal rights of man, and burn the place. So, after about 2 hours, they burn the place down, hallow fraternity up to a point. So the British then become very antsy, because Sierra Leone does have the best, and decide, can we actually leave this colony of Freetown to its own anarchic political devices? Because along with the arrival of politics and government and elected juries and all the rest of it comes contention. And there's an ongoing argument about water lots, which is complicated, who gets the best lots, and delays in getting land again up in the back country where the coffee plantations were. And in fact, there are a series of little rebellions, one of which is led by Henry Washington, rather amazingly. So, finally, Henry Washington becomes an American all over again. So you've got to put him out there, actually, in your display. Yes, lady here.
I'm just very curious, back to Nova Scotia.
Back to Nova Scotia, though. But
back to Nova Scotia.
Yeah. Right.
When the American colonists came, they caused a second exodus for the Acadians, of course, were already
That's right.
and
Right.
had been sent previously in 1755 to be slaves
Right.
called the White Negroes in Virginia.
That's right. Yeah.
Carolina.
That's right.
I'm just curious if Clarkson or any of the writings that you've read on that period ever addresses that. The fact
No, they know nothing about the Acadians, and it is sort of shocking. Or at least, actually, I haven't read anything they have to say about it. The earlier generation, of course, a lot of them Irish, in Halifax and Scots do know about the Acadians, but they were thrilled about this kind of semi-genocidal dispersal. What is actually very interesting is an extremely good question, because actually one of the reasons why Nova Scotia is picked as a place for the loyalist emigration resettlement is because it was, quote, underpopulated. Well, guess why it was underpopulated? Because it had been, government kind of cleansing, ethnic cleansing policy had taken place. But actually, a generation on, I'm sure there must be somewhere in the Public Record Office, but actually, do those who actually want to have a kind of free black resettlement in Nova Scotia talk about that earlier? That, not to my knowledge. It may be I just missed it, but I didn't see anything about that. Yes, lady here.
Was there any attempt by slaves to go back to their country of origin or their land of origin?
Of course, actually, the question is actually whether they go back to language and tribal areas, and the answer is yes. A man called John Keisel, for example, he is one of the real survivors, who'd been a slave in Virginia, was from the Sherbrooke country, and remembered pretty much exactly the village he'd come from. He goes back to the Sherbrooke country, and he makes a rather smart move that he'll be a river trader, and actually not a farmer. And he ends up, very old man, one of the great powers of Sierra Leone all the way into the 1820s, a sort of patriarch with a fleet of river trading boats. There was one man, actually, whose name is Francis, oh my goodness, I've forgotten, incredibly moving, it's in the book, I'm sorry. And he actually runs into his mother, at least in fact he does, there's no doubt about it, by pure accident. He's a Temne, actually. At a market, and it's the most amazing reunion that Clarkson is sort of, assumes this is the ultimate blessing of God upon the whole exercise, however difficult it was. So there is some evidence, actually, and I think some of them, most of them would have been really very small when they were so, but it's hard to tell how much Bullom and how much Sherbra. There was one very interesting man who was from the first migration out of London blacks and the earlier migration to Sierra Leone in 1787, who are specifically under the sponsorship of Granville Sharp, a man called, despite his name, because he'd been taught English in London by a Welshman, he's called Abraham Elliot Griffiths. And he is very proficient in all the river languages, particularly in Sherbra. And he marries the Naimbanas, one of the Naimbana, the sort of paramount chief's daughter, and he becomes an interpreter, actually, after one of the villages is burnt down, between the two groups. So there is some... your general point in this extraordinary arc completed is rather wonderful. And as I say, there was a lot of misery and heartbreak as well, but for some it was just an amazing homecoming. Yes, lady here, and then I'll come to you. Yeah. Right, yes, absolutely. It's an important New England point, and I'm sure you all know it, that at the beginning of the Revolution, of course, there are a lot of black volunteers. And they join the militia until some of the colonial assemblies, New Hampshire was the first one, decide it's not such a good idea to arm blacks after all. Washington, when he's actually on Cambridge Common, being in his early weeks and months as Commander-in-Chief, wrestles with this problem. He, at that point, is quite in favor, actually, of free black volunteers. And then there is, precisely because of the Dunmore Proclamation, precisely because of the Ethiopian regiment, and Washington suddenly calls Lord Dunmore that arch traitor to humanity for daring to emancipate the blacks of the South. There was a sudden massive shift away. And I detail that, and so do all the historians, Sylvia Frey, for example, who've worked on this. Through the end of 75, through all of 76, the militias actually prohibit, as in the words of the New Hampshire Assembly, lunatic servants and Negroes from actually joining. So there was a kind of unthreading of that possibility, much to the discontent of black soldiers. Now, during the war, there is a second switch around as a result of what the Patriots, what the Continental Army thinks is happening, whether it is or not, in the case of the British Army, and they rethink their policy. And the most famous black regiment, but a very important one, is Christopher Green's 2nd Rhode Island Regiment, in which are about between 200 and 300 blacks, some of whom have been slaves. It's Newport, centre of the New England slave trade, all of whom are promised liberty, just in exactly the same way. And we know a lot, of course, about black Continental soldiers, because after the Revolution, they were so invested in their entitlement to citizenship in return for the service that they've performed in the Continental Army. Army. It's often said, and I honestly do think this is, Benjamin Quiles's book, The Negro and the American Revolution, is a very important book, the first book to do this, published in 1962, has the figure of 5,000. I don't know where that 5,000 figure comes from. Might be right, but I just don't know where it comes from. What we do know is that it's often said that there were 1 in 4 black soldiers at Yorktown on the continental side, because there is one source that tells us this. Well, I do actually wonder about that, but what we do know is that many of the black soldiers serving in the South during that Cornwallis campaign were in fact pressed substitutes for white soldiers who were, because of the way the Cornwallis army behaved on its rampage through North Carolina and Virginia, absolutely were determined to stay on the plantations, lest in fact they get taken over by armed blacks. So instead of them serving in the Continental Army, they had they had the benefit of the French army at that point. They delivered black substitutes to the Continental Army. So there were blacks on both sides of Yorktown, and both armies behaved disgracefully pretty much towards them. The British abandoned their black, enormous rear train, at least 5,000 blacks with Cornwallis's army, some of whom were ill fed and some of whom were very ill, abandoned as pretty much, even before the surrender. But the day of the surrender sees black American officers going along. Well, first of all, it sees the most extraordinary spectacle of these blacks who'd been treated very badly. Cornwallis was an utter bastard towards his black soldiers, and perhaps towards most other people as well. But actually, it saw, despite that, it saw the spectacle of blacks trying to get to British ships. There were French ships blockading the harbour, but there was a rumour that the blockade was going to be broken. So they were lined up on the beach, waiting to be picked up. And they, of course, picked up by American soldiers who auctioned them off as personal property in the inns of Virginia the very next day. It was a terrible moment. I mean, both sides behaved, shockingly at that particular point. Now, there is, again, you're going to regret asking this extremely good question. There is one real American hero called John Lawrence. Now, weirdly, he's an aide-de-camp to Washington, and he was a sort of, bright-eyed, corn-fed, very clever boy who'd spent time in London before the Revolution. And he'd been sent to be a clerk in a law firm. And one of the partners of the law firm is a man called John Bicknell, who'd written the single most famous poem called The Dying Negro, about the importance of abolitionism. And John Lawrence had become an abolitionist in London, ironically. Took it back to America, became, of course, a fierce patriot. His father was the one who inserted there shall be no carrying off of Negroes, Henry Lawrence, in the Treaty of Paris after John Lawrence had been killed in a skirmish. But before that, Lawrence had the idea, which Washington was sympathetic to, of raising a regiment of 3,000 slaves. We're in 78, 79. The British are doing very well in the South at that point. 3,000 slaves, a black army, which he thought would actually succeed in thwarting the British capture of Charleston. And there was a general feeling in the Continental Congress that this deep intake of breath, big kind of, can we do it? Yes, we can. And then, of course, it's massively vetoed. It's voted massively down in the 2 Carolinas in particular, and Georgia, and it just doesn't happen. So there's there are mixed motives and feelings on both sides. When, towards the end of the war, the Continental Army is still trying to recruit young white men to the ranks, they offer them a bonus of 1 or 2 slaves at the end of the war, depending on that. So to say they're not completely invested in emancipation, actually. So, sort of moving, the whole of this story is not to replace American self-congratulation with British self-congratulation. Nothing could be more disgracefully unseemly and not the truth. But the story is a story of tragic complication. Look, my feeling about the way, am I allowed to say this in Boston? The way we treat the history of the Founding Fathers now, we all really wish our political leadership currently, whether we're Republican or Democrat or somewhere in between, was a little more capable, charismatic, decent, and effective than seems to be the case. Right. So current perplexity tends to turn history into a consolatory song, I think. At least we can say to ourselves, there was a moment when, in the shape of Jefferson and Hamilton and Washington and Benjamin Franklin and even James Madison, our leaders were indeed wise, virtuous, strong, intelligent, and victorious. And that indeed is true. But it is also true that history has its dark, deep shadows. The great strength and beauty for me all my life of Western history, and I'm a pretty happy-go-lucky fellow, has been the fact that it's a chastening muse. Thucydides begins Western history with the history of a military disaster, the expedition to Syracuse. Everything that is said in Pericles' funeral speech, usually the only bit that gets in core curriculum, is designed as a preface to the calamitous act of overreach represented by Alcibiades in the expedition to Syracuse. So the honor and truth and strength of Western history, unlike its self-serving histories of hideous totalitarian and fundamentalist regimes, is its ability to take on the chin tragic self-criticism. That's how history makes us free, if we're grown up enough to digest it. And with that, we should all have a drink.